Perfect. Hello to everyone. Welcome to the second day of the Volume Art Book Fair. Thanks for being here. Today we've got mass-produced of a high order, an artist books by Ed Ruscha from the Canadian Centre for Architecture's collection. Aujourd'hui, la présentation, c'est la production d'un masque de haute qualité, une présentation de livres d'artistes d'Ed Ruscha, la présentation d'une collection du Centre canadien d'architecture. Aujourd'hui, la présentation est donnée par Viveca Pattison Robichaud, qui est la conservatrice livre au CCA, et elle présente une sélection de livres d'artistes qui sont créés par Ed Ruscha, qui sont issus de la collection du CCA. So the CCA's Curator of Books, Viveca Pattison Robichaud, is here today with us and will give us a tour of a selection of artist books that are from the CCA's collection. So before we start, just a few things. My name is Maia. I'm the programming coordinator at the Volume Fair. I use she, her pronouns if ever you need. This meeting is going to be recorded and it'll be held on the Volume Montreal website for the time of the month of October, and then will be hosted on our YouTube channel. Apart from that, Viveca will be taking questions at the end. And vous pouvez aussi poser des questions en français, puis je ferai la traduction au besoin. Puis pour poser les questions, ça peut être soit à l'écrit ou bien au final, à la fin de la présentation plutôt, vous pouvez utiliser la fonction de lever la main. Puis je pourrais, ça c'est si vous voulez parler de vive voix, puis je vais vous laisser activer votre micro. So to ask questions at the end of the talk, you can either type them in throughout and I'll compile them during to ask them at the end, or you can raise the raise hand function at the very end, and then that'll let us know that you'd like to be unmuted to ask the question. Voila for housekeeping. And to present Viveca is the curator of books at the Canadian Centre for Architecture. She holds a Master in Library Sciences from the Catholic University of America, where she concentrated in cultural heritage information management. Robichaud's training in special collections in rare book librarianship is complemented by her studies in art and architectural history. From 2011 to 2019, Robichaud was the architectural special collections librarian at the University of Notre Dame. Active both nationally and internationally, Robichaud is an elected member of the Art Libraries Section Standing Committee of the International Federation of Library Associations and is on the Conference Planning Committee for the Art Library Society of North America. She's joining in from Italy today, and yeah, welcome everyone. And I'll be turning off my video for the time of the presentation and come back at the end for the time of the Q&A. Thanks for being here, Viveca.
Thanks, Maya, and I'd like to thank Volume Montreal for inviting me to present some of these books from the CCA collection. I've really enjoyed preparing for this talk. A couple of notes, if you like what you see here, or if there are other things from our collection, we're having an open call for our online open sessions, which you can find in the opportunities section of the CCA website. And the deadline to apply for that is October 16th. So if you're a faculty member preparing for your classes and you'd like to highlight some of the collection materials from the CCA, please, I encourage you to apply. So to start out, I'd like to give a bit of background on the Canadian Centre for Architecture and our collection of artist books. While we house a sizable collection of them, we cannot compete with institutions like the Museum of Modern Art, who've been at the forefront of collecting artist books since their inception. The Canadian Centre for Architecture is an international research institution and a museum premised on the belief that architecture is a public concern. One of the main tenets of the institution centers on our collection, which we see as a repository of ideas, provocations, inspirations, and trial and errors. Through the collection, it documents the culture and production of architecture worldwide from the Renaissance through to the present day. Concerning artist books, what we have collected and continue to collect unsurprisingly reflects our institutional mandate and has something to do with the built environment and our collection in general. The Bookworks of Ruscha consist mainly of photographs of everyday buildings with examples of 26 gasoline stations, every building on the Sunset Strip, and some Los Angeles apartments, They consist of recognizable everyday items in the form of 9 swimming pools and a broken glass, various small fires and milk, and familiar yet unremarkable items that make up the urban landscape in the guise of 34 parking lots in Los Angeles and a few palm trees. Ruscha's books, sorry, how do I? There we go. Ruscha's books present these objects in a deadpan manner. There is no text, save for an address or location, and the images are presented on a white background in the same placement on each page. The covers are all quite standardized as well, with short descriptive titles in bold block letters. In many instances, the only text that appears in the books are the titles and the copyright information. As part of an understanding of these books, we should first look at the way in which architecture and the history, the architectural history of Los Angeles was being thought of and discussed in the late 1950s and 1960s. The city of Los Angeles, compared to East Coast cities, not to mention Europe, is new as a modern urban environment without much historical precedent for how to build modern urban spaces. The books that Ruscha created, therefore, are some of the first examples of historic documentation for the city. In 1965, the same year that Ruscha published Los Angeles Apartments, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art published A Guide to Architecture in Southern California by historians David Gebhard and Robert Winter. This book, which you can see, documents the historic and significant structures in and around Southern California and includes maps and photographs. This marks the first time that an architectural guidebook was produced for Los Angeles, and it features examples of the significant styles of architecture, including early 19th century mission architecture and modernism from the 1930s and 1940s. The works of prominent architects like Craig Elwood, Richard Neutra, and R.M. Schindler were featured through the photographs of famous city photographer Julius Schulman. Often these photographs were shot with dramatic lighting and from vantage points that required special access. These photographs, or the views that they displayed, were not possible for the average Angelino or tourist even to recreate. It's also at this time that you have the foundation of a historic preservation commission in Los Angeles. So there's now like starting an interest in creating a canon of historic architecture for the city and protecting it. This is in contrast to the photography that Ruscha emphasized in his work. Taking photographs of everyday landscapes, things not deemed important for documentation, Ruscha is focusing attention on a different sort of architecture and city life, the everyday mass-produced city. Ruscha said of his work, not just his books, quote, "I have always operated on a kind of waste retrieval method. I retrieve and renew things that have been forgotten or wasted." Edward Ruscha's first book, 26 Gasoline Stations, was originally published in 1962, though it's often cited as 1963. And throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, Ruscha produced 16 small books, which had a profound impact on the genre of artist books. While these books are certainly not the livres d'artistes from the turn of the century in Paris, which showcase beautiful intaglio or lithographic prints created by famous artists to illustrate classical texts and works of poetry, Ruscha's books were almost exactly the opposite. They have nearly no text at all, and the pages are sparse. They're not even particularly expensive productions, although he does mention in an interview that he works with the best printer west of New York. But most importantly, the photographs which make up the text of these books are of mundane, everyday objects, mostly in and around Los Angeles. But don't let these seemingly simple works fool you. Ruscha put an incredible amount of thoughtful deliberation and planning into each one of these publications. Here's a quote from Ed Ruscha on his books. Quote, "I know that my books are not thought of in the same way as my paintings are. People take a painting and they put it back in a vault somewhere, but these books they'll just throw on a shelf, and that amuses me. The fact that it turns over and affects people. People get the pictures and look at the pictures and they put it away, and eventually somehow it just kind of ends up in the trash, which is okay. That's all right with me. It doesn't bother me that much that they might decompose or not be thought of as objects of art, because they're definitely not." And in another instance, speaking about his books, Ruscha says, quote, "There is a fine line as to whether the book is worthless or has any value. To most people, it is probably worthless. Reactions are very varied. For example, some people are outraged. I showed the first book to a gasoline attendant. He was amused. Some think it's great, others are at a loss," end quote. Now, there's a story that I've heard, though I can't, I've heard it repeated, but I haven't been able to track down the actual source. And that's that Ruscha wanted to sell 26 gasoline stations actually at gas stations, particularly those featured in the book. And he was selling them for $3 or $4 when he first printed them. So it's almost the appropriate price point for a gas station, but I don't think this ever actually happened. So now to discuss the works in a bit more depth. As you can see here, this is 26 gasoline stations. And the work was first conceived by the title. Ruscha thought of the title and then thought it would best be envisioned as a book. He spent many hours thinking about this book, and he dreamt about this book, and he fussed over every detail prior to putting it together. The images are all taken from his car along Route 66, driving from Los Angeles, his newfound home, to his birthplace of Oklahoma City. So the road goes through California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. The images themselves depict gasoline stations devoid of human connection with the road in the forefront. There was, however, a personal connection with the stations since they were on a trajectory that Ruscha would have driven many, many times. The stations themselves were chosen for their lack of distinctive character. In fact, Ruscha states, quote, "The eccentric stations were the first ones I threw out. I didn't want to have the look of variety to it necessarily," end quote. Ruscha said of his process for conceiving of and making the books, quote, "Once I have decided all the details, photos, layout, etc., what I really want is a professional polish, a clear-cut machine finish. This book is printed by the best printer west of New York. Look how well made and crisp it is. I'm not trying to create a precious limited edition book, but a mass-produced object of high order. All my books are identical. They have none of the nuances of the handmade and crafted limited edition book. It's almost worth the money to have the thrill of 400 exactly identical books stacked in front of you," end quote. In addition to having each book of a publication the same, without any personality or personal touch, Ruscha also made each of his books in a very standard format relative to each other. Here you can see the likeness of size in the books stacked on top of his head, illustrating their uniformity here. Probably his most iconic book, Every Building on the Sunset Strip, printed in 1966, is different from the others in that it is a 25-foot long accordion fold rather than the standard codex format of the other titles. The title, though, as with all of Ruscha's books, indicate exactly what the book features, which in this case is a photograph of every single building on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. Ruscha pasted together the individual photographs for the publication, and you can see on one side of the street on the top part of the page, and the other side of the street upside down at the bottom. To take the photographs, Ruscha placed his camera on a tripod on the loading area of his pickup truck, and then took several pictures per second as he and his team drove along the Sunset Boulevard at the speed of 12 kilometers per hour. So sort of like his own proto-Google Street View. His images of Sunset Boulevard were specifically for this publication, but he employed this technique over many years, documenting the important boulevards of Los Angeles over time, shooting at least 500,000 photographs. Recently, the Getty Research Institute, in conjunction with the J. Paul Getty Museum, acquired the photographs and the rare archival material from Ruscha, which comprises of over 1 million images, hundreds of contact sheets, and the complete production archive for this publication, Every Building on the Sunset Strip. This grouping, which they're calling the Streets of Los Angeles Archive, reveals the systematic effort to capture a city's architecture and thoroughfares by one of its leading post-war art figures. And it's informed by distinctive street signage and billboard culture of Los Angeles. And this project spans more than 40 years and documents many major streets in the city, including Melrose Avenue, the Pacific Coast Highway, as well as the iconic Sunset Boulevard. With the announcement that the Getty has acquired this archive, they have also started a project in which they plan to digitize this collection of images and make public for the first time a resource for scholars of history, art, architecture, and urban studies. And since Ruscha was interested in documenting all aspects of urban culture, every building on the Sunset Strip, as well as his other documentary photography of Los Angeles, serves as a great study and a resource. It is not monumental and famous architecture depicted by Gebhard and Winter, as we saw earlier, but it's this vernacular architecture of the everyday. It's the architecture that we have for so long been conditioned not to pay attention to disregard, and to pass over. And also, since Ruscha continued to take photographs of Los Angeles, these photographs serve as documentation to the architecture and urban evolution of the city. While the project is still ongoing, you can find more information about it through the Getty Research Institute's website. I think they're planning on doing a big sort of map view of monuments in Los Angeles as documented by Ruscha, but I think their timeline is a little bit slowed due to the pandemic. Ruscha employed commercial production techniques when printing his books. The aim, as he mentions in interviews, was to create something that was slick and commercial rather than handmade. With the exception of the first printing of his 26 gasoline stations, which were hand-numbered, subsequent printings of the same title, as well as his other publications, were not handmade in any way. In fact, he kept some of his publications in print to avoid them ceasing to be available, and becoming collector's items. These books are all printed to get a clear, crisp machine finish that, in terms of artist books, are printed at a kind of a high volume. We would print them in like 2,000 at a time. He says of these publications, quote, "The final product has a very commercial, professional feel to it. I am not in sympathy with the whole area of hand-printed publications, however sincere." Various Small Fires and Milk, which you can see, consists of sepia-toned images of small fires, from matches, stovetops, torches, and the final image in the publication is that of a glass of milk. Ruscha says of this work, quote, "It's probably one of the strangest books. It kind of stands apart. A lot of people have even mentioned to me about how it stands apart from the others because it's more introverted, I guess. Introverted, less appealing, probably more meaningless than any of the other books, if you know what I mean," end quote. "34 parking lots consists of aerial views of parking lots around Los Angeles. These photographs were not even taken by Ruscha, but rather he hired an aerial photographer, Art Alanis, to take the photographs for him. And they're all empty parking lots. There's no cars. You can see cars routinely parked there because there's these oil stains left there, but they were taken very early in the morning before people had come to work. Nine Swimming Pools is one of the only examples of Ruscha's Bookworks which is in color. And since it uses color, the generic pools seem to take on an abstract meditation on the color blue. These are all hand-colored photographs prior to printing. To add a personal dimension to this work, I read that Ruscha made this book during a period when he was swimming a lot. So while the pools seem rather generic, like the gas stations and parking lots, they do relate back in some way to Ruscha and his sort of personal his personality and what he was up to at the time. For Ruscha, the employment of photography in his books is meant to be solely documentary. He is not interested in photography as an art form, but rather in its documentary quality. To this regard, I quote Ruscha again, quote, "The camera is used simply as a documentary device, the closest documentary device. That's what it's all about. Drawings would never express the ideas. I think facts are in these books. The closest representation to an apartment house in some Los Angeles apartments is a photograph, nothing else. Not a drawing, because that becomes somebody else's vision of what it is. And this is the camera's eye, the closest delineation of that subject." End quote. For an artist who seems preoccupied with text, his books certainly do not present much, though Some Los Angeles Apartments has images of buildings that some of which have text on them, which is often juxtaposed with the captions indicating the addresses of the buildings and filled with repetition. They're really kind of devoid of text. So I'd now like to take a moment to discuss how these titles came into our collection. Many of them were purchased prior to the opening of our building, directly from Printed Matter, one of the most famous artist book vendors around. Still operational, even through the pandemic, Printed Matter is the world's leading nonprofit organization dedicated to the dissemination and appreciation of artist books. A quick glance at Printed Matter's Instagram page will indicate the lasting presence and popularity of Ruscha's books. During the pandemic, one of their sales associates even recorded a video discussing 26 gasoline stations and its significance, though sadly, the store did not have a copy of the book in-house at the time, so in the making of the video, they weren't able to use a real copy. We purchased Some Los Angeles Apartments, every building on the Sunset Strip, 34 parking lots, 9 swimming pools and a broken glass, and real estate opportunities from the store in 1988. None of these titles cost us more than $20 and most were around 10. So I'm assuming it was this sort of price set by Ruscha plus whatever exchange rate and perhaps some shipping fees. More of Ruscha's books were purchased at the request later on in 2001 at the request of our curator of photography, Louise Desi, in preparation for the show entitled Learning from Ruscha and Venturi Scott Brown, 1962 to 1977. Which discussed the work of Ruscha, Robert Venturi, and Denise Scott Brown, and was on view in our octagonal gallery from March to May 2004. This exhibition looked at the relationship between Ruscha's books and the architecture of Venturi Scott Brown, which deals with the architecture and urbanism of the everyday, both in Los Angeles and Las Vegas during the 1960s and 70s. We have also been fortunate to receive donations of Ruscha materials, helping us fill the gaps within our collection. In 1999, the slipcase to every building on the Sunset Strip was donated to the collection, thus making complete the copy we had purchased from Printed Matter in 1988, which did not have a slipcase. We have a second copy of every building on the Sunset Strip, which was donated by Phyllis Lambert more recently, and our first edition of Some Los Angeles Apartments and the second edition of 26 Gasoline Stations were a gift from Melvin Charney. And they complement copies that we also had purchased previously from Printed Matter and then also through another used book dealer. So now that we've looked at some of Ruscha's works from our collection, I thought it might be nice to take a look at some of the work that he inspired. When I mentioned that he is still extremely popular, he is also incredibly influential. So much so that Printed Matter typically has a section in their store for Ruscha-inspired works. This book that you see here, Various Small Books, referencing various small books by Ed Ruscha, serves as a catalog to some of these books, issued by MIT Press in 2013. And you can see here some images from some books that they put in their catalog. Jonathan Monk, an artist in his own right and an art collector of artist books, published some of his collection in collaboration with Bookworks entitled Cover Version in 2004. And so here you see some of Ruscha's covers that made it into the book, along with others from his collection. Coming a little bit closer to home, this example of work inspired by Ruscha is 36 Fire Stations by Jan Serendur from 2004. This work, which you can also order through our bookstore, is conceived of 40 years after Ruscha published Various Small Fires. Playing off of Ruscha's first work, 26 Gasoline Stations, this work documents 36 fire stations that were operational in our city of Montreal on December 19th, 2001. This next work is by Takashi Homa, whose photography will be part of our next Octagonal Gallery show, slated to open later this fall. This work from 2016, entitled Various Shaped Hoses and a Snake, is an homage to Various Small Fires. In this work, Homa takes photographs of hoses as well as one photograph of a snake. Lastly, I thought we could look at the work inspired by Ruscha that was done by Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. Here we can see in their handbook on vernacular architecture where they acknowledge the influence of Ruscha by including a Ruscha-inspired elevation and photo collage of the Las Vegas Strip. Venturi and Scott Brown turned their attention to the overlooked aspects of architecture, the gasoline station, service buildings, and those structures which were not thought of as monumental or worth documenting, much like Ruscha spent years doing in and around his home of Los Angeles. So I would like to thank you all for listening to my thoughts on Ruscha and his influence. It's lovely to be able to talk and look at these works regardless of our physical locations. That being said, I would like to take a moment to emphasize not just about our collection, but collections of artist books and libraries generally, that in these study rooms, reading rooms, special collections areas, etc., there's the possibility that patrons can have the kind of access to these artworks that they were meant to have. Libraries give patrons access in the same manner that you would give access to any other book in the collection. You're able to hold the work in your hand, though sometimes for the safety of the object, we might ask you to wear gloves. But still, you can feel the pages and move freely through the volume and have that sort of intimate experience with a work of art that would not normally be possible in your typical museum or gallery setting, but one that's rather exclusive to a collector or owner. So I would like to encourage any of you, should you be so inclined, and when we have the okay to open again to the public, to make an appointment with our reference team and request any of all of the items shown today or any others that you can find in our catalog. You can search the genre of artist books in our catalog to browse what titles are available in the collection, but I'm also happy if you want to reach out to myself, and we also have a fabulous reference staff that you can also ask for more information. So as we know more about when we're able to open due to current regulations, that information will be available on our website too, and feel free to also reach out to us. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Thanks so much. Is now the time to invite anyone who's got questions, dans n'importe quelle langue. S'il y a des questions en français aussi, ça ne me dérange pas de faire la traduction. And questions can be asked in the Q&A tab at the bottom, and you can type them in that format, or if you use the raise hand function, then I have the power to unmute your microphone and ask the question live. Vous pouvez écrire soit dans l'onglet de Q&A pour écrire la question, ou bien utiliser la fonction de lever la main, puis je peux activer votre microphone à distance. Voilà. I can start. I had no idea that he had hand painted the pools.
I don't exactly know what the method was. I know that I read that they were hand painted, I think, to make them much more vibrant, because the blues are so incredible.
That's wild. I feel like that totally breaks with his ideal of having everything like manufactured.
I think they were printed, I think he hand colored the images and then the whole thing was printed.
Yeah, like hand printed the negatives.
Yeah.
Yeah, but still, I feel like for someone,
or he had somebody else do it, maybe.
Yeah,
that might have been more in line with,
perhaps, with his no touching. I don't know if this is, or where even I heard this, but that he had made the slip covers himself. Is that possible?
They were like wax paper.
Yeah. But I wonder if, they were also part of the whole industrially made side of things, or if he had to make them by hand.
I know slipcovers become like in all sorts of books, like they're sort of this like kind of throwaway thing, but if you have them, it's like much more valuable. And if you can have them and they're in good shape, then it makes, makes books much more valuable on like a secondhand market.
Yeah. I've got this comment from David Stevenson in the Conservation Lab at the CCA. He says that it's possible to put a blue filter over the pool areas to make them super saturated.
Ah.
Could be a thing, but still, especially if you say that like photography is this factual way of looking at things, and then he's altering it in the end.
I feel like his work is full of contradictions. Like I think that the whole like numbering of the numbering of the books at the very beginning was a very deliberate thing, and then saying, "Oh, I'm not going to do that anymore," is like it sort of it was very conceived, I think.
Yeah. I received a question here asking if we know how many books he would have printed of each title.
They're all, I don't know the number specifically off the top of my head, but they're all printed inside, and with the copyright information, you can see, I think the first print run of 26 gasoline stations was like 400, but then he printed another one that was like 500, and some of them were like 2,000, but there's a note on the inside for all of them, and it'll tell you like first edition had 3,000, second edition had 2,000 and whatever. So he's very transparent about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Whereas I feel like if you truly wanted it to be an absolutely democratic print run, then it would be open at all times. And I mean, I guess, just with fame and knowledge of his work, then just gives this extra. Of course, now they're much more difficult to acquire and cost much more than $4
too. Yeah, I was looking. I did a quick search before this, and like some of them, like you could buy there's one group of like 3 for sale on ABE Books that's like $12,000 or something. So
yeah. I guess we failed him in that way.
Well, that's why I think libraries are important, because if they collected them, then they have them, and you can still have an experience with them that isn't, you don't have to shell out, $12,000 to come into the CCA and look at them. They'll let you come in for free.
That's true. That is an important
Once we're open.
Of course. All right, I've got no open questions at the moment. I'll give a few seconds for anyone who wants to throw in some more before we end. But thank you so much. No, I'm really glad for the CCA's participation and for you to take time in your day for doing this with us.
Yeah, it was my pleasure, and hopefully next year we can do something in person.
Yes, I would like that a lot. All right, then, we'll let everyone off, and voila.
Thank you.
Thank you, Viveca. Bye, everyone.